if you want to open up to the Acts 19, I'll be reading from the New American Standard. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, they stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Thank you.
So as we continue here in the book of Acts, if you've been following with us, you're going to see that Paul has been traveling. Paul has come out of Macedonia, that's north of Greece. Some of you, when you were still in school, because the maps always change, you would still consider that as Greece, and some of the cities are in the country of Greece today. But it was an area called Macedonia, and now he comes into Greece. He went to Berea, he went to Athens, and now Paul is moving on to the city of Corinth. And it's a new city. It's a new ministry. It's a new opportunity. But in this occasion, we see at the very beginning that he's alone. For Paul usually travels with companions. He travels with people who assist him in ministry. On the first ministry, he and Barnabas were a team. On the second missionary journey, he's been accompanied by Silas and by Timothy and by Luke. But as he goes into Corinth, he's by himself. And he's beginning to look for opportunities to share the gospel. And yet he's also without support at this time. And we see in the city of Corinth that he is supporting himself by his own vocation, which was that of a tent maker. Sometimes you hear of tent maker ministries. That's when a person is working a job in order to fund their own ministry. So they may move into a community that can't afford to support a pastor, can't afford to support some sort of Christian organization, and they're working during the week, and then on the weekends, they're fulfilling some sort of ministry obligation. And we call those tent-making ministries. That's because Paul had this example many times in his ministry. Even when he did not have support, he wasn't going to stop the ministry, but rather said, if no one else will fund me, I'll fund myself, because I've been called by Christ to preach the gospel. Whatever the cost, whatever the means, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure the gospel is preached. But it must have been an unusual situation for Paul. He's alone, and he's going to a city which we would think is an unlikely place for the gospel to really take hold. Corinth has, if you read your commentaries, it had a pretty bad reputation. It wasn't those type of places where you would expect to find good religious people with spiritual hunger. In my own mind, I always kind of thought of it as the Las Vegas of Greece. Now, that may not be really true. They didn't have casinos, but they probably had showgirls or some sort of equivalent. It had a really bad reputation. And it reminds me that, you will find God in places where you're not looking for him. And God is working in places that we don't expect. I had a friend of mine back in Utah, and before he came to Christ, even though he had been very successful, his own addictions eventually ruined his marriage, cost him his profession, and for a short period of time, he ended up homeless, kind of wandering the western United States, and ended up at, like I said, of all places, in Las Vegas, where he came to find Jesus Christ. It's not normally where I tell people to go to find Jesus. But God is working there, right? And we know God is working in places that we may, at first understanding, think, why would we go there? But God is working. And it's not the circumstances that we need to look to, but rather look for God in the circumstances. And so we're going to look this morning here about how God is doing an amazing thing in the city of Corinth. And so we read in chapter 18 here in verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to visit Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So if you're wondering where Corinth is, I said it's in Greece. This is where Paul is on his second missionary journey. If we make it a little bit bigger, if you ever notice the country of Greece, it's got this really skinny neck in the middle of it, connecting the north and the south. The south is called the Peloponnese. And Corinth is right on the entrance to southern Greece, where that narrow stretch of land comes to the southern part, is a city of Corinth. And it was a very advantageous place to have a city. It's along all the trade routes. They also created this overland road right there. They didn't have a canal of those days, but what they would do is ships could offload on the one side of the isthmus and take the overland route. They could even haul the boats overland, because to go around the southern tip of Greece with the technology of the day could be very difficult, and it was longer than taking the goods and services. So they had an economic opportunity, a strategic importance, and trade routes, and it was always a very prosperous city. Classical Corinth, not to get sidetracked too long in a history lesson, was one of the major city-states, along with Sparta and Athens and Thebes and all the ones you learned about in your history books. Oh, incidentally, as you look at the picture, this is Corinth up on your screen, and that giant rocky outcropping also made a pretty impregnable fortress at the right where the isthmus comes together. You go through the narrow stretch of land, and there's this giant hill before you. It had all of the geographical advantages to make it a successful city, and it was a successful city in ancient times. And this is that ancient city that was known for its immorality. And you may read in books about how the temple of Aphrodite had over 1,000 shrine prostitutes. And that to be called a Corinthian was an insult, to say you were of low moral character. To Corinthianize meant to go about in sexual immorality. And so a lot of people read into the New Testament text and say, oh, Paul was in a really immoral city. Well, the problem with that understanding is that the Romans destroyed that Corinthian city in 150 BC. They were in a war with Rome, and they made an example out of that Greek city before all of the other Greek cities, so the war would end, and they completely leveled it. And it was desolate for 100 years. Then in about 44 BC, it was rebuilt as a Roman colony. Now, this is almost 100 years later at this point that Paul shows up and the city is thriving again and has probably some of the same issues. They still have the same pagan deities. They still have the same low moral standards by biblical understanding. They're still a port city with all the vices and problems that can come with that. But you do want to make sure when you speak, oh, well, this is what Paul was dealing with, that you're actually being historically accurate if you're going beyond the text. So Paul steps into the city and he begins to minister, and he is preaching in the Sabbath, and God has given him new people to minister with. So many times we think about our limitations instead of God's resources. And it's really easy to stop. It would have been really understandable by our understanding why Paul might say it's not the time. But Paul in his conviction continued in ministry. And God brings him two new companions, Aquila and Priscilla, who are both Jewish by ethnicity. They understand the Old Testament, who are Christians. And they were partnering with him in ministry, even doing the same trade. And they begin to reason in the synagogues. And then by the time we get to chapter 5, eventually Silas and Timothy join up with Paul again. We read, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. You see what's happening here? I know sometimes it's difficult as we preach through the book of Acts to have those clear directions, because what we have is a narrative seeing what God has done in the situation. We don't have those explicit commands saying, go and do this or don't do that. But what we rather see is God at work here. And while that may be harder to preach certain points, I hope what you catch this morning is that God is at work when we don't expect it. God provides when we don't have the means. And look how well this is turning out for Paul. He's come into a city alone, without means. And in a short period of time, he's given new co-laborers. His old companions have rejoined him, and he's given a place with which to conduct his ministry immediately next door to the synagogue that he has been thrown out of. And not just that, but people are coming to Christ, including the ruler of the synagogue. So the Jewish leader of that community is now a believer in Jesus Christ. God is not limited by our anxieties. He's not limited by our lack of ability. But rather, as we're going to read in a few moments, we see that when we are weak and we are dependent on him, that his strength is revealed. And we need to remember that. We do see as Paul and Silas arrived, his ministry exploded. Now, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Well, it's generally understood that he moved from a part-time ministry to a full-time ministry, because when Timothy and Silas came, they came from the churches in the north. Notably, remember the Philippian church financially supported Paul's ministry. And so he now doesn't have to spend his days making tents and his weekends preaching, as it were. But he can devote himself full-time to the preaching of the gospel. We catch this inference in other places, such as in 2 Corinthians. We read Paul writing to the Corinthian church, saying, I robbed other churches. Now, let's just stop right there. That's a figurative way of saying he did not rob other churches. He did not break in at night, run off with the safe and the offering. But he's saying, I used the resources that other churches could have had for their own ministries in order to minister to you. He says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to serve you. And when I was present with you and was in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For when the brethren came from Macedonia, they fully supported my need. And in everything, I kept myself from being a burden to you and will continue to do so. So we see that the churches that he has been in are supporting the ministry at this present time. And the gospel is moving. And yet in the middle of all of this time, we see that Paul has troubles. We often don't think about that, right? We think of Paul as somebody who is brave and single-minded and committed. But we see that apparently Paul also struggled with the same things that you and I do. And it's understandable, no matter how single-purposed he was, the guy had been beaten quite a lot by this time. Do you ever have that internal time clock going in your head, like just waiting, something bad's about to happen? Things have been going good for too long, and whether you should think this way or not, you're like, I'm due. I'm just due. And probably Paul's internal clock is starting to go off. The ministry is going on. It's now time for me to get my beating again. Because that's what's happened almost every step of the way. He's been stoned and left for dead. He's been whipped. He's been flogged. He's been thrown in jail. He's been run out of town. The guy's been beaten more times than a piñata. And he's starting to say, maybe I should just preemptively leave the city. Now, we can't say exactly what he's thinking, but we could imagine what he's thinking. On the other hand, he also knew that when the Gentiles started coming to Christ in these cities, such as Justus opening his house, and a lot of Gentiles coming to believe in Jesus as a Messiah for the entire world, that oftentimes it would provoke the Jewish leaders to jealousy. And that's when the riots and the problems would start. And that's why he had to leave Thessalonica and Berea. And so perhaps he senses trouble is brewing. But in the middle of all of this situation, we see that God speaks to him. And let's consider the words that God says here in verse 9. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to hurt you. For I have many people in this city." And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. What a beautiful break. Kind of a spiritual oasis where he could say, I don't need to look over my shoulder anymore. I can just preach the gospel. We're not always promised these times in life, but when we get these opportunities, we need to seize them for the gospel's sake. When God gives us open doors, we need to walk through them. When we have the opportunity to proclaim God in peaceful times, let's not miss those. And so God has found Paul at a low moment in a city where we might not expect the gospel to take hold, and he does a great thing. He establishes a church in Corinth. And I know you and I, because we're going to, as we do our summary, as we're following through the book of Acts, about how these different letters connect to the historical events of the book of Acts, I'm pretty sure you're aware. We're going to be in 1st and 2nd Corinthians here very shortly for a summary. And when we read all the problems in the city of Corinth, we may not think very highly about the Corinthian church. But we see that the Corinthian church was firmly established and had a large number of believers. And yes, they had problems. But God was bringing people from death to life, and it was firmly established. This is not a failure just because we see the later problems in the letters. This is a great success. And we see how God protects Paul and God protects the ministry. There's a really unusual thing that happens here. We've talked about this individual named Gallio, and if you're with us for the first time this morning, that's not Galileo. He comes centuries later. But Gallio is an Italian official who is in the city of Corinth. The reason we've talked about him before is because we know he was there for 2 years. That we know the 2 years he was in Corinth as a historical reality. It's also how we know when Paul was in Corinth. We can neatly date the time, 51 to 52 AD, that Paul was in the city of Corinth. Because this Gallio guy is not some insignificant figure. He is connected to Roman aristocracy. His brother is Seneca. Now, maybe you don't follow classical antiquity and history. Seneca was the tutor to Nero in his younger years. He did not encourage him on his bad behavior of the later years. He actually got put to death by Nero because Nero liked to kill everyone. But this man was connected to the upper class emperors and their advisors, and he happens to be the ruling official in Corinth. And God is going to use his providential placement now to provide the peace that he has promised. So we read, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters." And he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Gallio took no notice of these things. So what happens? Paul is promised that he will be at peace in the city, that he does not need to worry, and he is dragged before the court. And if he's like you or I, you may be thinking, this does not seem like the peace that I was promised. But God is going to show up in a big way, for the Jews level their accusations, accusing him of sedition because he claims that Jesus is king. And the Romans would believe that only the emperor was the king. But Gallio sees through what is happening, and he doesn't care. It's like, I have more important things to do than to deal with your petty religious squabbles. And in his environment, he may be pretty irritated with some of the Jewish leaders. They've recently been expelled from Rome. Now, we can't assume that they were causing trouble in Rome, but his perception could be, this is a troublemaking group. I don't want to deal with them. And so, as Paul in this environment wants to speak his defense, Gallio says, let me just stop you right there. I've got this. Which is always a really good thing when the judge says, you don't need to speak. And he says, if this was a problem, I would deal with it. If this was a threat to the empire, he would be dead. But this is a religious dispute. And so you deal with it yourself, and you better not cause any trouble in my city. And as a means to make his point, he does not commission it, but he easily looks the other way when the leader of the synagogue receives the beating that I'm sure Paul thought he was about to receive. When God is for us, we do not need to worry who is against us. And that's something we need to be reminded, because we sang that song this morning, Ancient Words, and it's a great song because we see who God was and what he did. But we also have to remember the reason it's a great song, because who he was and what he did has not changed. God has not changed. He is alive and well, and he is active, and he is for his people. And so when we look at the past and we look at the book of Acts even this morning, we should be reminded that that same God has said to us that he will not leave us, he will not forsake us, and he will be with us until the end of the age. He has not left us as orphans, but he is present and he is with his people. And it doesn't mean that we will not go through difficulty. Paul would be beaten again. Paul would be jailed again. But to know that God is with us both on the mountaintops and in the valleys, working all things for his good purposes and for the good of those who love him. We see that Paul was protected in the city of Corinth. Paul writes that I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecution and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We see this has happened here in this mission to Corinth. Paul came in alone, without means, and seemingly a little bit afraid. But what does God do? While Paul has none of the usual support that he normally has, God provides for him physically, spiritually, and gives him an open door to minister to the people. And incidentally, the open door that he gave through Gallio was a precedent, which that basically meant for the next decade, near decade, in the growth of Christianity, they were given a free pass by Roman officials, because he was significant enough as an official that people could look to Gallio and say, oh, the Christians are just a Jewish sect. The Jews, by the way, had a privileged religious system within the Roman Empire. They didn't have to give honor to Caesar, as the Christians later would be persecuted for. All of a sudden, the Christians are just given an open door for the gospel for a decade. It's not just Paul who is reaping the benefits of God's interaction. It's all of the Christian churches in the Roman world. So we get to see a time of rest and a time of reaping. There's a lot we could go here, so we'll just skip. But I want us to remember that God's ways are beyond our imagination, that God is sovereign, and that God is strong when we are weak. Again, we see that some of the things that Paul writes back to the Corinthians. He said, brethren, when I came to you, this is in the letter to the Corinthians in chapter 2, when I came to you, I did not come with excellence of speech or wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And so what about us? We know that we'll have difficulties. We know that we'll have anxieties, but can we understand that God will not leave us, that he is with us, and that he is just as able today as he's ever been? And we will have difficulties. I think Charles Spurgeon was quoted as saying, there are difficulties in everything except eating pancakes. So if the great theologian says it, I think some days there are difficulties eating pancakes, or at least cooking pancakes. But whatever it is, we are not promised prosperity, but we are promised God's presence. And whether we are in the flames or beside still waters, whether we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil because he is with us. And God promised not to forsake us, and he is faithful. And we see in the middle of difficult times, I also want us to not lose sight of that fact that those may be the opportunities. Difficult times cause us to rely on God, which is a good thing. When we put our trust in God and prayerfully ask for him to work instead of depending on our own efforts, that's when we get to see him move. And oftentimes the difficulties which plague us, the difficulties of this world, affect those outside the church. And that gives an open door for people who say, why are you okay? Things aren't okay. And it can point us to the hope that we do have, knowing that this world is not our home. And even as we travel through it, we know who is with us, and we can introduce them to him. We can introduce them to Jesus Christ. So while we may not always have an open door, and we may not always be at peace, we do have the same God who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, who will be faithful to us as we seek him. The means may differ, but his character is the same, and his purposes are established forever. So let's seek him, let's serve him, and let's pray for open doors to share him. But let's keep our eyes firmly fixed upon him, knowing that he is our strength, and he will see us through. Let's pray.